The old rancher's weathered hands trembled as he finally revealed the truth. "I've said my father's name 3 times every day for 60 years, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Not out of love, but to remind myself of the promise I made standing over his grave." The entire town of Willow Creek fell silent, the secret that had defined Thomas Blackwood's life now laid bare for all to see. No one would ever look at the stoic rancher the same way again. If you're moved by stories of redemption, family secrets, and the power of forgiveness, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. Thomas Blackwood wasn't always the respected rancher who owned half the valley. Long before the sprawling ranch and the cattle empire, before the charitable donations that kept Willow Creek's economy afloat during hard times, he was just a scared boy with a burden too heavy for young shoulders. This is his story, one that would remain buried for decades until a chance encounter forced the past into the light. Willow Creek had always been a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The small Montana town, nestled between rolling hills and vast stretches of ranchland, prided itself on community. Neighbors helped neighbors. Secrets were rare and short-lived. Or so everyone thought. Thomas Blackwood arrived in Willow Creek in the harsh winter of 1963, just 17 years old with nothing but a small leather satchel and eyes that seemed decades older than his face. He found work at the old Henderson place, a once thriving cattle ranch that had fallen into disrepair after Old Man Henderson's stroke. Thomas worked harder than men twice his age, speaking little, observing much. When asked about his past, he'd simply say he came from back east and change the subject. Sarah Miller, the town's schoolteacher, remembered the day Thomas first walked into the general store. There was something about him, a sadness, but also a determination. Like someone running from something but also towards something else. Within 5 years, Thomas had saved enough to buy a small plot of land. Within 10, he'd expanded to what would become the foundation of the Blackwood Ranch. He married Ellie Thompson, the daughter of the local doctor, and they had 2 children, James and Rebecca. From the outside, Thomas Blackwood had achieved the American dream through nothing but grit and hard work. But those closest to him noticed peculiarities. Every morning at sunrise, every afternoon at precisely noon, and every evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas would stop whatever he was doing, turn to face east, and whisper something under his breath. His wife never mentioned it to others. His children grew up thinking it was just Dad's thing. Ranch hands knew better than to ask. It was like clockwork, said Frank Donnelly, who worked as Thomas's foreman for 30 years. Middle of calving season, business meeting, family dinner, didn't matter. He'd excuse himself if needed, but those 3 moments of the day belonged to whatever ritual he was performing. The town speculated, of course. Some thought it was a prayer. Others suggested it was a superstition that had brought him luck. A few of the more imaginative souls wondered if it was a curse. But Thomas never explained, and eventually, like his mysterious past, it became just another accepted eccentricity of the town's most successful resident. Until the summer of 2023, when everything changed. Rebecca Blackwood Hayes had returned to Willow Creek with her husband and teenage daughter after 20 years away. Her relationship with her father had always been strained. Thomas was loving but distant, generous with material things but stingy with emotional connection. She'd left for college and never really returned, building a life in Seattle as a corporate attorney. Dad was getting older, Rebecca explained. After Mom passed, he was alone on that big ranch. James was overseas with his military career. Someone needed to check on him. What was meant to be a 2-week visit stretched into a month as Rebecca found herself drawn back into the rhythm of ranch life. Her daughter, Lily, formed an unexpected bond with the grandfather she barely knew. Thomas, now 77, seemed to soften around his granddaughter in ways he never had with his own children. It was Lily who first asked the question no one had dared to ask in decades. "Grandpa, why do you always stop and whisper something 3 times a day?" The family was having dinner on the ranch's sprawling porch, watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the distant mountains. Thomas froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Rebecca started to scold her daughter for being nosy, but Thomas raised his hand to stop her. "It's a fair question," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time someone asked it." That evening, as lightning illuminated the vast Montana sky, Thomas Blackwood began to tell a story he'd kept buried for 60 years. He wasn't from back east, as he'd always claimed. He was born Thomas Blackwell in a small coal mining town in West Virginia. His father, Richard Blackwell, was a foreman at the mine, a hard man made harder by the death of his wife when Thomas was just 5 years old. Richard turned to alcohol to numb his grief, and young Thomas bore the brunt of his father's rage. He wasn't always cruel, Thomas explained, his voice steady but distant, as if reading from a script long memorized. There were good days when he'd teach me to fish or tell stories about my mother. But those days grew fewer as the years passed. By the time Thomas was 16, the abuse had escalated. Richard Blackwell's drinking had cost him his position at the mine, and his resentment toward his son, who increasingly resembled his late wife, grew toxic. The beatings became more severe, the verbal abuse more cutting. The town knew, Thomas said, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing. Everyone knew. But in 1962, in a company town where my father had once been somebody important, nobody intervened. Not the sheriff, not the school principal, not the neighbors who heard my screams. On a cold November night, after a particularly brutal beating that left Thomas with 3 broken ribs and a fractured wrist, he made a decision. While his father lay in a drunken stupor, Thomas took the man's wallet, changed the spelling of his last name from Blackwell to Blackwood, and boarded a westbound bus with no destination in mind. "I ended up in Willow Creek by chance," he said. "The bus stopped here for a meal break, and I saw the 'Help Wanted' sign at Henderson's. It felt like fate. But the story didn't end there. 6 months after Thomas fled, he received a letter forwarded through a series of post offices. His father had died, not from alcohol as Thomas might have expected, but from grief and remorse. After Thomas disappeared, Richard Blackwell had sobered up, desperate to find his son and make amends. He'd spent his last month searching, leaving letters with authorities in dozens of towns, begging for information about a boy matching Thomas's description. The letter came from Richard's only friend, a fellow miner, who wrote that Richard's last words were an apology to the son who wasn't there to hear it. "I was 17 years old," Thomas said, his voice finally breaking. "I felt relief. Then guilt for feeling relieved. Then rage that he'd found a way to burden me even in death. I burned the letter, changed my name legally to Blackwood, and vowed never to speak of him again." But that wasn't entirely true. The next morning, I woke up and realized I couldn't remember my mother's face anymore. All I could see was his. And I became terrified that I would become him, that his rage and weakness lived in me. So Thomas made a promise to himself. 3 times every day, he would say his father's name, Richard Blackwell, not as a memorial or an act of forgiveness, but as a warning to himself. Every sunrise, I'd say his name to remind myself who I refused to become. At noon, I'd say it to check my actions, to make sure I hadn't slipped into his patterns. At sunset, I'd say it as an accounting of the day, measuring the distance I'd kept from his legacy. For 60 years, through building his ranch, through marriage and fatherhood, through every success and failure, Thomas had maintained this ritual without fail. 3 times a day, he faced east, toward West Virginia, and whispered the name of the man he'd fled. "I never hit my children," Thomas said, looking directly at Rebecca for perhaps the first time in her adult life. "I never drank more than a single glass of whiskey. I built something from nothing. I kept my promises and paid my debts. I did everything opposite to how he would have done it." But in doing so, Thomas realized he'd created a different kind of damage. His fear of becoming his father had made him emotionally distant. His determination to be financially successful, to never experience the poverty of his childhood, had made him work obsessively. His children had never known abuse, but they'd also never known true emotional intimacy with their father. "I was so busy not becoming him that I never figured out who I wanted to be," Thomas admitted, tears finally spilling down his weathered cheeks. "I ran from his ghost for so long I forgot to live my own life fully." Rebecca was stunned into silence. Her husband held her hand tightly as tears streamed down her face. But it was Lily, just 15 years old, who stood up and wrapped her arms around her grandfather's shoulders. "You don't have to say his name anymore, Grandpa," she whispered. "You proved your point." The story might have remained a family secret, but fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to the Blackwoods, their conversation had been overheard by Maya Chen, a young journalist who had recently moved to Willow Creek to care for her aging grandmother. Maya had been walking by the ranch, seeking shelter from the approaching storm, when she heard Thomas begin his tale. Ethically conflicted but professionally intrigued, Maya approached the family the next day, apologizing for the inadvertent eavesdropping but asking permission to tell Thomas's story. Her reasoning was compelling. How many others were living in similar silence, carrying burdens from the past that poisoned their present? After much deliberation, Thomas agreed, with one condition: the story wouldn't be published until after a town hall meeting where he could tell the truth himself, face to face with the community he'd been part of for decades. On a warm August evening, the entire population of Willow Creek squeezed into the community center. Thomas Blackwood, the town's most prominent citizen, stood before them and told his story from beginning to end. He spoke of abuse and escape, of a 60-year ritual born of fear and determination, of success built on the foundation of what he was running from rather than what he was running toward. When he finished speaking, the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, people began to stand and share their own secrets, burdens they'd carried, rituals they'd maintained, pasts they'd hidden. The town's beloved doctor revealed his decades-long struggle with depression. The high school principal spoke of growing up with an alcoholic mother. The owner of the general store admitted to a gambling addiction he'd overcome 20 years earlier. "It was like a dam breaking," Maya Chen would later write in her award-winning article. As if one man's courage to speak his truth gave everyone else permission to unburden themselves of secrets too heavy to carry alone. In the months that followed, Willow Creek transformed. Thomas established a foundation to help victims of domestic abuse, funding a shelter in the neighboring county and a scholarship program for survivors. He began speaking at schools about breaking cycles of violence. Most importantly, he started therapy, at 77 years old, to finally process the trauma he'd been outrunning for 6 decades. His relationship with Rebecca blossomed as they both worked to understand how the past had shaped them. James took leave from his military post to spend time at the ranch, having difficult but healing conversations with his father. And Lily, the catalyst for it all, documented everything in a series of photographs that would later become a traveling exhibition called 3 Times Daily, Breaking the Silence. Thomas stopped saying his father's name at sunrise, noon, and sunset. Instead, he began a new ritual, calling his children and granddaughter, not out of obligation but out of genuine desire to connect. The man who had built walls to protect himself from becoming his father finally understood that those same walls had prevented him from fully becoming himself. 1 year after his public confession, Thomas stood again before the town, this time at the dedication of the Blackwood Family Community Center, a place specifically designed for people to gather, share their stories, and find support. "For 60 years, I defined myself by who I wasn't," Thomas said to the crowd. "I said my father's name 3 times a day not out of love or respect, but out of fear and determination. I thought that was strength. I was wrong." He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, his family in the front row, and continued with a voice that no longer trembled. "True strength isn't found in running from our past or hiding our pain. It's found in facing it, sharing it, and then, the hardest part, letting it go. I wasted decades looking over my shoulder at the man I was afraid of becoming. Now, in whatever time I have left, I'm looking forward at the man I still have the chance to be." The story of Thomas Blackwood spread far beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek. Maya Chen's article went viral, leading to interviews, speaking engagements, and eventually a documentary. Domestic violence organizations reported increased donations and calls from people seeking help. Therapists noted clients referencing the Blackwood story as inspiration for confronting their own family traumas. But in Willow Creek itself, the impact was more personal. The town that had prided itself on knowing everyone's business discovered how little they'd truly known about the people they saw every day. The revelation created a new kind of community, one built not on surface-level familiarity but on authentic understanding. Thomas lived 5 more years after sharing his secret. In that time, he sold most of his ranchland, keeping only the original homestead where he'd first started building his life in Montana. He traveled with Rebecca and Lily, making up for lost time. He reconciled with James. He fell in love again, at 80, with Sarah Miller, the former schoolteacher who'd noticed his sadness on his first day in town all those decades ago. When he died peacefully in his sleep at 82, his funeral was attended by hundreds, including people who had traveled from across the country after being touched by his story. His tombstone, in accordance with his wishes, bore a simple epitaph, Thomas Blackwood. Finally at peace with his whole story. The ritual that had defined his life, saying his father's name 3 times daily as both warning and measurement, had ended. But its impact continued, a reminder that sometimes our most closely guarded secrets, when finally spoken aloud, can become our greatest source of healing, not just for ourselves, but for others who recognize their own unspoken pain in our words. In Willow Creek today, the Blackwood Family Community Center hosts weekly storytelling circles where people share the burdens they carry and the rituals that have shaped them. A plaque in the entrance bears Thomas's final public words, "The heaviest secrets are those we never share. Speak your truth. Someone needs to hear it as much as you need to say it." And so the legacy of a man who said his father's name 3 times a day for 60 years lives on, not in whispered rituals born of fear, but in spoken truths that set others free.